Hey everybody, Alex Cohen here.
And I'm Sara Sadhwani.
And welcome to the latest edition of the Inside the Issues podcast. As always, so much to talk about, including the end of the 3-week plus saga of who wants to be the next Speaker of the House and what that means for some local members of Congress.
Absolutely. And that other big race, which is for the Senate, which continues to heat up. We have some updates we'll be discussing.
And it's going to be an international episode in that Governor Gavin Newsom left California, went to Israel, went to China. We'll talk about what he did and did not do there. But let's kick things off with this interminable race to the Speaker's House. I feel
MAGA
like,
Mike.
MAGA. Yeah, now we've got MAGA Mike Johnson.
I keep calling him Magic Mike.
You're not the only one. I, at one point, got so bleary-eyed. I'm ashamed to admit this. I was texting with the local California GOP to try to get some comment on it from their chair. And they said, well, what do you want to talk about? And I wrote, Mike Jordan, Mike Jordan, Mike Jordan. And they're like, the basketball player. And because of Jim Jordan and the, I'm embarrassed to admit that. But that's right. It was because it's been such a blur these past couple weeks trying to track who was the latest person. And I think it's been so fascinating to watch, like no Kevin McCarthy, but also no Steve Scalise, also no Tom Emmer, no Jim Jordan. Yeah. And then this guy, I mean, so random.
I had to Google who he was.
So did Susan Collins of Maine.
Oh, gosh.
And no, it's true. She told CNN that. It is a real deal. So if you're still like in that, who is this guy anyway, don't worry. We're here to help. This is Mike Johnson of Louisiana, very conservative Christian, also a constitutional lawyer. And just to get a little bit more of his flavor, why don't you take it from California's very own Mike Garcia, who took a few moments after the big vote this week that made it official, letting his constituents know about the breakthrough.
Hey there, California 27. It's Mike Garcia. Hey, in the nation's capital today. And yes, we finally elected a Speaker of the House after what was 3 weeks of dentistry. We landed on a gentleman named Mike Johnson from Louisiana. He's a good leader. He's a good conservative. He's probably a little more conservative than what California would elect.
Probably. Yeah. You're right, Mike Garcia.
Bans on abortion.
A little bit more conservative.
Yes.
Yeah, bans on abortion, does not support gay marriage, voted to overturn the 2020 election in favor of Trump. So, yeah, probably a little bit more conservative, even than many of the Republicans that we have here in California. Of course, we have some who are very supportive of Trump and MAGA Republicanism, but many who are also quite moderate and independent.
Yeah. So I think this is a good juncture to bring on our weekly segment, something that we do here called What's the Word? The word, Sarah?
Job.
J-O-B. And so many things to talk about on this front. You know, this is a big job, and I think usually people think of the Speaker of the House being someone who's been in politics for years, someone like Kevin McCarthy, who's got tons of experience, tons of staff, knows how to raise money, all of this stuff. And here comes this guy that literally you and senators were Googling, and is pretty far to the right. So I think, it's one thing to get elected to that job. It's another thing to actually do the job.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I mean, I this says so much, I think, about where Republicans are, where the Republican Party is, right? I mean, I think this far-right group is really seeing this as a big win for them because they wanted McCarthy out, they got him out, and now they have, Jim Jordan's mentee. They weren't able to get Jim Jordan himself, but apparently MAGA Mike is very close to Jim Jordan and really seen as kind of that silent partner who's been supporting him all along. And so now we've seen him come forward. When we think about our two-party system, poli-sci 101, here we go. We talk about this as big tent parties, right? That the parties over time have to stretch and include various new elements that might pop up. Third parties don't do very well, but instead the party itself stretches. And that, I think, is what we're seeing happen here, right? The Republican Party has most certainly moved much further to the right with this new speaker. But so many questions about how this plays out in the 2024 election. I think, Democrats really ought to be taking this one to the bank, because in 2022, we saw the rejection of Trumpism at the ballot box in so many different races in so many different ways. It leaves you really pondering, what does this look like for 2024, where Trump is doing great in the polls amongst Republicans, and yet we've seen this rejection of his politics at the ballot box as well.
I think it's, I hope my number's right here, I believe it's about 18 districts nationwide where a Republican was elected to Congress, but Biden won in those districts. And I think that what you've been seeing here in terms of Southern California, look, this was a unanimous vote amongst Republicans for Mike Johnson. Every single Republican from California said yes to him. And I think there's a lot of folks like Mike Garcia who live in much more purple districts going, kind of like biting their nails. Are they going to remember this come next year? There were threats of primaries to other Republicans throughout the country when they took the vote on the floor. There were a couple of Republicans from New York, and when they called out, Mike Johnson for speaker, you could audibly hear Democrats yelling, bye-bye, like that's it, seal of, kiss of death there. And some quotes that I thought were kind of interesting. Mike Garcia is saying that it's critically important that we message correctly. We've got one of the most conservative conferences now, probably in the history of the Republican Party. We have to be mindful that there are still those in swing districts that need to be able to navigate some of these issues. John Duarte, also of California, saying that he supports an effort to get the government's fiscal house in order, and he had a warning for colleagues pursuing hot-button social issues. The quote is, "If the conservative majority starts to feed us things that are socially conservative and messaging bills that we don't want to sign on to, well, then they'll get some pushback." But
what kind of pushback? Tell me what kind of pushback, because you didn't have any pushback on this vote. That's for darn sure.
Yes. Yes.
This is such a fascinating piece, right? Because the Republicans were really kind of stuck in a hard place. Do they move forward with this very conservative individual who is a Christian podcaster? He and his wife are Christian podcasters.
The truth be told, with Mike and
Kelly
Johnson. Yes,
yeah, that's right. Or do you also recognize that the total chaos that the Republican Party has been over these last 3 weeks is also not good as a electoral strategy? And do you just move forward and see what we can get done? There's a lot on the plate, right? We know that there is funding measures for Israel as well as Ukraine, that there is a government shutdown that is again looming, that they will have to figure out if they're going to work on that or let the government shut down. It is unclear if a leader like this is going to say, let the government shut down, because it seems like this is a group of Republicans who really want to wreak chaos in Congress. So it's
and I think this is where the job of being a Republican Congress member from California sucks. Like they had no good choices, right? I think they were dealing with the exhaustion and the fatigue of grinding through all these behind closed door candidate forums and roll calls and all the rest of it. They knew that, like you said, right, their options were either we elect this guy and that could have some consequences, or we say no to him, in which case you might lead to a scenario. They were talking about Kevin McCarthy co-chairing, like having an assistant to the assistant regional manager of Jim Jordan, and like, what would that look like? That's not a good option. Just having it like the metaphor that coming to mind for me was that the Republicans were all in this car and they drove themselves into a ditch and they kept trying to vroom out of it. And the more that they did, the deeper they got dug in. So they didn't have a whole lot of options.
But this is already starting to play out here in Southern California, right? Down in Orange County. Already billboards have gone up calling out Michelle Steele, also in one of these very purple districts that went to Biden in 2020. For being too much of an extremist. Last week.
But these billboards, which I think we should, this is also just kind of like a brilliant little California political nerd nugget. So a while ago, I think it was the New York Times and Newsmax who were the first to report about that billboard, which, by the way, features Donald Trump and Jim Jordan, because that's what was happening in that moment, right? So everybody was talking about that billboard. And then actually, I want to give a shout out to Cassie Simeon, who covers the California delegation in D.C. And she asked if one of the photographers at Spectrum could go film it. And they looked, it was a street on Buena Park. They drove up and down, and it wasn't there. Oh. And it turns out that they had acquired the billboard, but they hadn't actually gotten it up there yet. It would not be the first time that maybe the Gray Lady didn't get all their SoCal facts right. Just going to say it. And then, of course, by the time the billboard gets up there, it's already Mike Johnson as speaker. So I think people driving by would be like, but wait a minute, why is Jim Jordan up there?
Would they even know the difference, though?
And, well, and I do think, actually, the one thing about that billboard that's interesting to me, too, because it gave the phone number, right? Like, call this number from Michelle Steele's office, which was very similar to the playbook that we saw, which tried to get Jim Jordan across the line, where there were these very pro-Trump activists that kind of doxed all these Congress members, saying flood their phone, offices with phone calls.
Even calling like people's spouses and kids and stuff. Leaving nasty messages. Yeah.
All part of the job. All right. Let's pivot and talk to another job that somebody doesn't want.
Yes. Recently, she comes out. Our new U.S. Senator Laphonza Butler has said she will not run to seek election to this office. Of course, remember, she is the appointee from Gavin Newsom. There was a lot of speculation about whether or not she would run, and she has said, no, thanks.
And I have to say, this was one of the most hotly watched questions among the political reporter crews. Another shout out to another podcast, Political Breakdown, Scott Schaefer and Marisa Lagos at KQED. And I asked both of them, and Marisa was like, she's going to do it. She's going to run because she could get all this momentum and she could do it. And Scott said, no. She knows better. She's not, it would be so much of of her energy while trying to do the job. And I think it's, hats off to you, Scott. You called it. I personally would have put my money with Marisa, but that's another
I thought
story.
She was going to run.
I thought that the statement that Laphonza Butler put out about why she didn't want this job was so interesting. I want to read a little bit from that. I've always believed elected leaders should have real clarity about why they're in office and what they want to do with the responsibility and power they have. She goes on to say, knowing you can win a campaign doesn't always mean you should run a campaign. That's exactly the vocal effects that I made when I read that the first time. I know this will be a surprise to many, she wrote, because traditionally we don't see those who have power let it go. It may not be the decision people expected, but it's the right one for me. Mic drop, Laphonza Butler. I just read that and I was like, damn.
I know. When you hear the word public servant and read a statement like this, does that not define a public servant? She's just really no thanks. I'm not going to be the power-seeking career politician that everybody else is. And for me, that I was like, I want you even more, Laphonza Butler. But, obviously there were so many other candidates already for this job out there.
It would have been a hard lift while you're learning how to Senate, right? You're also trying to fundraise and campaign.
Though she clearly has the Rolodex to do that,
yes, that's
right?
True, right?
But yes, it would have been a very, very expensive race here in California. The primary is months away. So it definitely would have been a huge lift.
But for me, the line, too, is that I know this will be a surprise to many because traditionally we don't see those who have power let it go. And that's you talk about public servants, Sara, and when you think about the job of an elected, your job is supposed to be being a public servant. And yet I think we see time and time again the thrill. I think it was Reggie Jones Sawyer, and I think he was talking about Laphonza Butler when he likened that acquiescing of power to being like crack cocaine. I mean, I remember hearing that and being like, whoa, that is quite an analogy. But I've never been in that position, and I'm sure it is, and especially to go from someone outside of elected office all the way up to Senate, do not pass go, do not collect $200. That's a lot.
It is, and I couldn't help but immediately thinking about Nancy Pelosi when I heard this as well, because recently the news came out that though she is no longer Speaker of the House and she stepped away from that role and passed on the baton to Hakeem Jeffries, that she's going to run again. Because I think there had been all the speculation of like, oh, okay, she's going to retire, and we just keep seeing folks, Dianne Feinstein herself, right?
Yeah.
Who was not going to say goodbye. She did hold on to the end, right?
Yeah.
And so there is something just so refreshing, I think, to hear someone who is clearly very competent and capable just saying, this isn't what I'm going to do.
For now. Right? There are other JOBs out there. There's a governor's race coming up in 2020.
And now we know her name. We know all about her. Yeah.
Yeah.
Could be exciting.
Very, very exciting. And I also want to say, too, there is something about the freedom of being able to do your job in the Senate when you give zero you-know-whats about re-election. I mean, of course, you got to think about your future political or future career period, but how liberating it must be, like, unlike those guys in the House.
Constantly posturing and jockeying.
Well, and even voting for House Speaker, where they're like, I want to vote this way and I want to get reelected. And those two things might be different. To just have the sole function, hopefully, or the soul's 100%. Like driving mission be like, I want to do right by my constituents. I'm just going to read one more part of her statement because I thought it was so great. When she put this out, the time count was 383 days left as senator. And she said, Muhammad Ali once said, don't count the days, make the days count. I intend to do just that.
Beautiful.
Quick update on everybody who is looking to take that job. We've got some of the latest fundraising numbers from those leading the pack. Adam Schiff, currently in spot number 1 over the past 3 months, has raised $6 million. Katie Porter bringing in more than $3.3 million over that same period of time. And some real concerns about Barbara Lee, who raised about $1 million. That's a lot to you and me, but there have been talks about the burn rate, right?
Yeah.
Ads are really expensive.
Yeah.
TV ads, especially here
Campaign
in Southern California.
Staff is really expensive too.
Right, and if you're burning through all of that so quickly, there's been some, I'm sure that Barbara Lee exhaled a huge sigh of relief when she heard Laphonza Butler wasn't running.
Yes.
And yet, and she just had to inhale once again.
Yeah, and yet
keep
those
going.
numbers aren't necessarily suggesting that she would have an easy time making it past this primary.
No.
Coming up, next month, the Democratic Party itself for the state of California is going to be meeting to make their endorsement. I think that will be a fascinating one to see where that endorsement lies, even though that doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot. Last time around, they had endorsed Kevin De Leon. Did not win, obviously, against Dianne Feinstein. And so I'm really curious to see what the party does on this endorsement. This
Indeed. Ooh, fodder for a future episode. But let's stay with this week, this extraordinary week where our governor, Gavin Newsom, left California. We got one of those emails again. Governor's no longer in the state. He had a very long planned out trip to China, but at the last minute, late last week, he announced that he would be stopping in Israel. And he met with some folks there and heard some pretty harrowing stories, posted a little bit about that. But then he went to China. He made 5 stops there. He began, we're going to run through them, Hong Kong University. They have a system that's a lot like our UC system, plays a pretty big role in climate action research. This was, if I didn't mention, a big climate trip, which we'll talk about in a minute. In Guangdong, he looked at the transition toward all-electric vehicles. In Beijing, he and the first partner visited a local school. I've talked to the first partner about this. She's a big fan of farm to school as a way to help support farms and to help feed kids healthy, nutritious meals. So they got to look at the Chinese equivalent of that. In Guangzhou, the governor visited an offshore wind facility. Offshore wind's been a big plan of his here in the Golden State as well. And then last but not least, he went to Shanghai, where he visited a Tesla gigafactory. It's apparently the most productive EV manufacturer in the world. Sara, is this, I'm going to ask a pointed question, is it the governor's job to go to China?
I don't know what job it is that he's trying to have right here.
A lot of people have asked that.
Yeah, look, we've talked so many times about what is it that Gavin Newsom is trying to do after he is governor of California. He's clearly not running for president and is all Team Biden. But these kinds of trips, his planned debate with Ron DeSantis, his Fox News interview, like he has this massive profile that he is creating for himself. Clearly, he's going to do something with it at some point in time. Now, look, is it his job to go to China? Maybe. I mean, both Schwarzenegger and Jerry Brown both did similar trips to China. So there's certainly some precedent for it. I think I saw some of Newsom's comments saying, look, relations with China have been really tense over the last several years. And for the Chinese government and the president himself, he had to sit down with the leader of China.
And that was unclear for a while.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. So in Newsom's mind, this perhaps suggests some thawing of relations. That's interesting, I think, to me. Is that necessarily what the California governor needs to be doing? Is that a part of the job description? No, but California is a leader in so many different
as is China,
and we also have the largest ports on the West Coast, right? And this is a huge part of our industry. My husband, as I was sharing with you before,
he's in China
too. The Canton Fair. This is a big time for anyone who's importing products into the United States. So this is absolutely something that resonates for many Californians who are in this business. You know, when you look further to the eastern sides of LA County, imports is what most folks are doing out there in all of the warehouses and City of Industry and Vernon and all sorts of other places. So this is absolutely a big part of the California economy.
I think I've said it here before. I'll say it once again. I think Gavin Newsom is a lot like Bikram yoga. I've yet to meet a person that feels meh about Bikram yoga. People love it or people hate it. And that's kind of how people feel about Gavin Newsom. And if you're really interested in climate change and you see this as a big trip to like try to get the whole, because no one can do climate change action in a bubble, right?
No,
we all
exactly.
share the same skies, the
one
same waters. So you could say, hey, this is a great move. But if you're someone who doesn't like Gavin Newsom, this is not going to endear you to him and the job he is doing. To that point, I spoke earlier this week with former Congressmember Doug Osee. You'll remember he was also one of the Republicans vying to replace Gavin Newsom in the unsuccessful recall attempt. And he said, look, I'm all for climate action, right? I think that's great. But he said this is really not his job. He cited the Logan Act as something that dates back to 1799. It prohibits private citizens from engaging in unauthorized correspondence with foreign governments. Here's what Osee had to say on that front.
That's my beef, is that whether you're going to China or Israel or Mexico or what have you, the reckless nature of introducing yourself into these discussions between our country and another country muddies the water as to who speaks for the United States.
Now, it's interesting to note the governor kind of got heat on both ends, not just from the right and folks like Doug Osee, but also from the left, people raising big concerns about the human rights record of China, right? And saying, well, you know, if you're going to go there, you first of all, going there is kind of, you know, is that condoning the human rights concerns that have been raised for years? Or could the governor say something about it? And it's interesting, although the governor said it was totally within his right, within his job to go to China, meet with their president. He said it was up to the federal government to talk to China about human rights violations. So it was like,
we get to pick and choose the parts of your job description that you want. I'll just note, though, New York City Mayor Eric Adams just recently went to Mexico. Certainly in the past, former Mayor Eric Garcetti has done trips abroad as well. I think there's a lot of precedent for these kinds of trips abroad. So.
And finally, one more item in the docket, local politics. I feel like it's been a long time since we've talked local politics.
We used to be like all up in city council and the Board of Soups.
But and there's stuff happening there as well. But this is actually a story about a local politician, a Democrat named Mark Gonzalez, who currently is the chair and has been for some time of the local LA County Democratic Party chair. He is now running for Assembly District 54, opened up by Miguel Santiago, who's running for CD 14.
Who is his boss as well.
Yes.
Right. He works as, district director, I believe that's for Miguel Santiago.
So recently, the Stonewall Democrats, LGBTQ political group, released their endorsements. Mark Gonzalez is openly gay. And Mark Gonzalez
did not get the endorsement.
Didn't
right?
get that job.
Yeah, and causing a big stir about what's really at play here. Some kind of gossip around the Stonewall Democrats and some of the shifts and changes that have maybe occurred in the last several years. Perhaps a more progressive move on the part of Stonewall Democrats. But interestingly, what came out was some concerns that were raised over his temperament and retaliatory behavior, which specifically in his job as the LA Democratic chair. So I think this is an interesting one where when you're holding multiple jobs, when you're wearing multiple hats, that might actually have some implications for you racking up some of these endorsements when you're on the path to climbing towards becoming a politician.
Yeah, true story in terms of that temperament, and I can't say I blame him at all. I once got to see that almost in person. We had both Mark Gonzalez and Larry Elder on an election night in the same studio.
I remember that.
Yeah, that's why you were there too. It got a little intense. I am not saying that at all justifies anything on an endorsement front, just saying. But I do think there's that bigger question about a job. If your job is to be a county party chair and you are giving out endorsements, does it then become kosher or not to be running for office? If you've got thoughts, we would love to hear them. You can find us on all sorts of social media channels. I am there at Alex Cohen in LA.
And I'm at Sara Sadhwani.
And we will see you next week. The Inside the Issues podcast is a Spectrum News One production. Crystal Goss is our producer. Nathaniel Leathers is our editor. The executive in charge of production is Jeff Shore.